So my guest today is the VP of Products, or previously the VP of Developer Relations and Developer Experience at Vercel, somebody who has inspired me personally, and I'm sure many others in the community, to learn and use React and Next.js, someone who I've been wanting to talk to for a long time, but actually didn't have a chance. So Lee, it's great to have you here finally.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I know we've kept in touch over the years and haven't had a chance to, connect on a call or do this type of conversation. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Absolutely. So I don't know if that was the proper introduction for what you're currently doing, uh, and I'm sure people, specifically my audience, circled around Next.js, probably know who you are. But why don't you give us a little introduction of what you do now and the journey into getting into Next.js and Vercel?
Yeah, maybe I'll go back to the start and work it up to now. I've always had a passion for the web and for open source. It's always been something that was really what drew me into programming in the first place. I was doing mobile apps and I was starting to dive into websites, but websites and the open web was really what hooked me on, exploring programming as a career, really. So I've always had an affinity towards that and got started building open source pretty early on in my career, but was not doing anything of public notoriety. Um, I spent most of my career doing product engineering work at fintech and e-commerce companies. And along the way, it was probably 2017, I think, going into 2018, we were rebuilding our React application to be server rendered. And turns out there's this great framework called Next.js that had just came out about 2016 that actually I had somebody recommend to me. So Michael on my team actually recommended it to me, and I was like, oh, I haven't heard of this before. I checked it out and I was just blown away by at the time how easy it was to use in comparison to some of the other tools and how well it solved the problem that we were having. And so we worked together to move our React e-commerce application over to use Next.js. And in the process of doing that, the community was still so early that there wasn't a lot of content. Like there wasn't a lot of, you run into an error and it was like, zero results found on Google. Like there's no place for me to find this information. The docs were still early. Like the team was really just getting things ramped up. So like a good steward of the internet and of the community, I was like, I want to be that person. I want to help out. So I would write content about things that I was building. I would try to create things when I ran into errors. I would try to answer other people's questions as well too. And pretty soon, 2018, 2019, and doing that, I had started to make a lot of stuff about React and Next.js. Going into 2020, the team at Vercel reached out and they're like, we see you everywhere in the community. Like you're very active here. Have you ever thought about doing this full time? And at the time I was like, I don't know, maybe. I was in my head, I had thought that I was going to be a product engineer forever. Like I thought that was where I wanted to focus in building great products. I didn't really consider kind of going full time into a more educational style role. But then, yeah, joined Vercel and helped start our developer relations team and spent the last 3 years doing that. And it's been an amazing journey. And I think we still have a long ways to go as well too, which I'm excited about. And then as of recently, I've also moved into this new role, helping influence more of our product development at large, which has been a good evolution for me, learning about the overlap and the similarities and differences between DevRel, marketing, product engineering, how to grow companies together. I think with other leaders at Vercel, when I joined, we were about 30 people, and now we're much larger than that. So it's been a fun ride.
Interesting. As you were kind of drawing the lines into your journey, I was able to kind of visualize whereabout I probably came across your content when you were trying to put out content on Next.js. I remember You had a course on Next.js. It was on Gumroad first, and then you had this React course that was the future of React, or learning React through Next.js, which back in the days wasn't that popular. You were learning React in the context of maybe a MERN stack application with a backend, Node.js, Express.js, and then React. And then React was like an individual SPA application, but your course was like teaching it through Next.js, through something that's server rendered, has a routing system inside of it. I remember I saw you, I think, first on a podcast or interview on somebody else's channel. I was like, I instantly liked the way that you were approaching this. Not sure if by that time you were actually in Vercel. I think you had joined, but it was like early times. You're very helpful, and your approach was different. Definitely has inspired me into learning Next.js. The way that you were putting this content out there, even your blog posts. There are several blog posts that I can pinpoint throughout my journey that kind of shifted the way that I was thinking about, whether it's CSS, or even you use the term now, product engineer. Back in the days, it was like front end developers or back end developers. This new shift to a product engineer that has to do everything from the style, the UI, but also writing APIs and server code is also something that you've talked about, and I've learned definitely there. So since my content is all Next.js, I live and breathe Next.js. I kind of followed your advice on probably what you had done early yourself to creating content. I remember when you first joined Vercel, I was subscribed to your newsletter, and then in one of them you were like, "Okay, guys, I've just joined Vercel as the head of developer relations. If you're enthusiastic about building a community, teaching and learning, why don't you join me?" And I reached out and I said, "Hey, I don't have any experience. What do I do?" And you said, "Go create some content." I was like, okay, that's a good first step. So I created the site, and then I wrote my first blog post about creating the Next.js site using MDX and Markdown in it, and then videos, and gradually growing, even with the app router, as you mentioned, because I saw there isn't much out there. There isn't much content out there. There's a lot of confusion. So I started kind of dabbling into it, reading the documentation, trying and testing, and trying to put some content out there. Now, a selfish question: what do you think of the videos on my channel? I would love to get your take on it.
Yeah, I think, oh man, there's so much to dig into here. One, I just have to say, first and foremost, I'm so impressed with your growth and your journey. Going back all those years ago when you were like, "Do you have any suggestions out?" And I probably could have gave a more in-depth answer, but I generally was like, making stuff is such a good forcing function for you to level up as an individual. That's certainly what worked well for me. And it's been awesome to see the not only the delivery of your videos iterate and improve over time, but the content, the production quality, right? Like the video setup, the lights and the plants in the background. Like I really love your setup as well too. So I think you're doing a
Thank you.
great job. And it's it's one of those things too where I actually get a lot of inspiration from Mr. Beast because he gets asked that question a lot of like, what should I do if I want to be a YouTuber? So he basically distilled it down to go make 100 videos and then talk to me again.
Yeah.
And I think it's a short answer, but what he's really getting to is that by the 100th video, you look back at the first one, you're like, oh, I made so many mistakes.
Yeah.
Like when I watch my first videos, I cringe.
Yeah.
I can't believe that I made all those little mistakes or the delivery of the way I did something. But now, years into it, I have so much more I'm so much more comfortable with my delivery. I'm comfortable on the topics I want to talk about. I've found my own style, and I think I've seen that with you as well too, where there's been this continuous leveling up of the content you're creating, and you can only go up and to the right. So it's been fun to watch.
Yeah. Okay. Great. It's awesome to have that from you. Definitely, this idea of creating content or putting yourself out there or learning in public, because in the beginning for me I was just trying to learn and trying to share what I was learning, like
Mhm.
creating portfolio site and then documenting the process. That blog post is the first blog post, and so far one of the best performing blog posts on my site. It's just literally me documenting how I created this, how I'm doing code snippets and syntax highlights and stuff. And with the videos is the same thing. And this idea has really pushed me to learn, because I think the best way to learn is when you think that you want to teach it to somebody else. It just forces you to learn it at a deeper level. So it has also helped me learn it at a better level. So if I'm doing a project or if I'm doing consultations now, I have seen it from all different perspectives. I've talked to the community. I've heard the pain points. I have tried different things, and I can share a more valuable insight into whatever it is that I'm talking about, for sure.
I think one thing you said earlier that I was going to mention was you talked about one of the first courses I was creating. I was leaning into building a full stack app with Next.js. And, I didn't really think about it until you just said it right now about how different it was from some of the other content that was out at the time. I knew what I wanted to do was focus on what does this technology actually enable you in terms of building products. But what was really interesting, in my opinion, was I I was teaching, and this kind of goes to your point about content. I was teaching what I had learned that I had found valuable that helped me make better products. So for me, building a full stack app in Next.js was the first time that I'd ever felt as empowered to really go from scratch, some idea, all the way to a live site on a URL that has Stripe on it that I can accept payments. Like, it was previously a lot more complex for me to do that and build something end to end on my own. And that was what I was trying to teach people through the course was you can do this too. Like everyone can, you don't have to set up, an Express server somewhere and then a couple other pieces somewhere and like stitch it all together. So I think that's a good insight that you shared. I didn't really think about, but it goes back to your point around how you make content. It is something that you're finding value from. Like, you learned how to put together your blog posts and your syntax highlighting, and you shared it because you went through that journey and you found it useful and interesting. You put it out into the world, and sometimes you get surprised by what content does well. You think you're just solving a problem for yourself, but actually there's a lot of people that can have that same that same desire.
Yeah, share the same kind of problem or having the same idea, trying to implement it, for sure. Now, we talked about the content around the app router, which is where I started kind of digging even deeper into these type of content back last year. I think we were approaching a 1-year anniversary of the app router being stable. I think it was sometime in May last year that it went stable. Um, and I want to get your take on your perspective from the company, from the team, from now the developer relations team facing this new paradigm change in the way we build React applications, Next.js applications. I remember back in the days, there was a lot of confusion, a lot of frustration, some pushback, some resistance into developers not wanting to change the way that they were used to do Next.js. And it was great the way that they were doing it. But also, the app router wasn't stable, so there was a lot of missing pieces there. So I want to get your take on, from your experience on that end, because I think you guys did an amazing job of kind of leading the community through this major change from last year to now, the app router being a stable product that a lot of companies are now transitioning into and actually seeing the value. And they're like, okay, now
Mm-hmm.
this is good. This seems to be the next thing. Let's just jump in. So I want to get your take on that journey as well.
Yeah, it's been a journey, multiple years now. I think that in software, the only constant is change. There's always new versions, there's always upgrades, there's always improvements, bug fixes, security patches. And the goal is to make that journey as smooth as possible. And at a certain point in all software, whether it's libraries or frameworks, at a certain point in its lifetime, there has to be more of a major evolution of the technology. And ideally, you can do it in a way that is incremental and that minimizes disruption to teams who have bet on the technology. One of the hard parts about the Next.js app router change has been a lot of people didn't have the 3 or 4 years of Next.js prior pages router experience before they saw this world. So for them, they're like, wait, why is it like this? This part is like a little bit confusing, or I just started on the pages router and now I see the app router. Like, I'm trying to understand the differences. For the people who had been building with the pages router for 3 years, it's actually very easy to forget all of the customer pain. There are people who are actually very frustrated with the pages router. Like, why is there no built-in concept for layouts? Like, I have this big JSON file that's getting returned from get server-side props. Like, how do I make this smaller? Like, how do I do global data fetching in my application was like surprisingly difficult. The list kind of goes on and on and on for things that in aggregate turned out to be a lot of paper cuts of the pages router. And the core thing that united them all was actually a fundamental re-architecture of Next.js to support streaming responses. This really was like a culmination of so many years of React's work on also being a system for scheduling UI updates and a system for transitioning between different variations of my UI, and having more of an opinion on the integration between the client and the server. From just being a client side only solution to, well, I mean, it's had, rendered to string for a long time, but really having more of only an opinion on the client side to having more of an opinion about what it means to have client and server features integrated together. And as that story was starting to be developed, a lot of the ecosystem exploration that Next.js did in the pages router, like, what does it look like to fetch data for a React component? What does it look like to define metadata for my document in a framework? What does it look like to, load link tags or script tags? A lot of those things actually require some pretty tricky problems to be solved at the library level or at the architecture level that are broadly generalized across a number of different tools. And the ecosystem goes out and explores a bunch of really great ideas. And the way React works, that I think has worked really well, is they're very slow to actually pull that into the core library. But when they do it with a minimal API surface area that is very intentionally designed. And the word minimal there might be different depending on your definition of minimal. To me, minimal means very intentional. So if an API is there, it's a building block for the community and for the ecosystem to build on, or for frameworks to build on. The way, I guess, to tie all this back to the app router is that we had to make a decision. Do we go all in on these new features and this new architecture? Do we align closer with the vision that the React team has for what a full stack integrated client and server experience looks like built with React, where you can bring composability to the server, where you can publish a package that fetches data and you can publish a package that has some data mutation? If we do that, it could solve a lot of the problems that we have with the pages router today. Let's call this 2019. But also, it's an entirely new router. And the core of Next.js really is the router. So I think we made a bet that was, in hindsight is 2020 here. I think it was the right bet. I also think that, again, it's hard to know exactly if there's things that we could have done differently in terms of the timelines of maybe it should have been out for 3 or 4 years in an incubation period before we let people really adopt it. Like, we can, and I've thought about these scenarios quite a bit, but I think it's very easy to be biased towards what's happened since then. At the time, it's easy to forget that there was a lot of people asking for changes to the pages router more imminently, and they were hungry and willing to go on this journey together with us of exploring what a new architecture would look like. So I feel actually pretty good about the path to get here, even though there's been peaks and valleys. I think the core thing that has made it worthwhile, I think, for the community is that you don't have to use it. And I think that's something that I feel like I've learned from React. You can still build a React app today that uses class components, hooks, and server components. Like it can do all of that in one app and actions, which is pretty mind blowing. There's like 10 years of React all in one file or in a couple of files. And the fact that we have been very intentional about incrementally bringing in this new architecture into apps, I think it's given the developer the ability to accept the level of tolerance and risk that they want for their project or their team or their own learning experience. So for large teams, maybe it's very slow. Like they're not going to wait until all of these things that they have on a matrix where they're evaluating whether they're ready to move or not is ready, which for a lot of teams we worked with, it took a while. For other teams, when they're just kind of building and hacking on side projects, they want to explore what server components are like or see what some of these new features are like. You know, probably like yourself, we're very willing to try to dig into this stuff pretty early and just try it out and get excited about the technology, knowing that there was going to be some sharp edges, but willing to go along the way and see how things are. And I think that's helped us get to a point where the best way for us to iterate on the product was to get it in customers' hands, get it in developers' hands, and get their feedback. And some of that feedback was really good. Some of that feedback was really hard. Some of that feedback was like, yeah, this part sucks. This part is not good. This part's slow. This experience, could be a lot better. And the only thing that we can do, the commitment that we have with the community, is just to listen and quickly iterate based on that feedback. And, now a year later, I think one of the biggest things we had heard, maybe three themes. The first one was around performance and how can we improve local performance for making changes in my editor, which really comes down to compilation and bundling. The second one was around caching. The app router comes with a lot of opinions about how you should do caching and cache invalidation across the client and the server. Maybe there's ways that we can make that easier. And the third one is more developer tooling to understand and observe how my system is working. And those have been the big themes from now, individual developers and companies shipping the app router in production. And, a lot of this happens where we're ideating on ideas and where we're just trying to figure out how we listen to it and work on this feedback, just on the team itself. And we're starting to slowly get some of these pieces out into the wild, where I'm really looking forward to see what people think. TurboPack I think we have maybe one more test to go till 100% of the tests are passing, which is really exciting. We have some improvements for caching coming pretty soon. We just released some in the last release that folks had asked for. And then we've started exploration on dev tools as well too. So a lot of the stuff is kicked off that I'm very excited by. The biggest thing to me is the commitment to iteration velocity. Like, it's not always going to be perfect, but you're guaranteed that we're going to listen and we're going to iterate and improve.
That's definitely been my experience observing the team and the progress and the development of the app router through the past year, that I've been involved very tightly with the community from one side, talking to people, talking to companies, developers, and from one side, seeing what's happening from the perspective of documentation, the product changing, the pieces coming together, or the iterations of, you guys actually owning the parts that needs to be changed. That's actually having like an empathic approach to the pain points of the developers and changing it. So that has been great to kind of witnessed over the time. My experience has been the same as you just touched on, coming from the Pages router, probably working 3-4 years building projects before the app router. Once I saw this new paradigm, I was like, there's no way I'm going back to the Pages router having these different functions that, I don't know, this runs on the server, that runs on the client, this is the component, that's the data fetching. But being able to just fetch data right inside of your server components, having native layouts, and this nicely still file-based routing system that you can now use to have suspend streaming loading skeleton or error boundaries as easy as adding a file. It was just a no-brainer for me. I knew that maybe in the beginning you just have to figure it out, or there's going to be sharp edges as you mentioned, but it was a point of no return for me. There was no doubt in my mind that this is just an easier way of building React applications. Maybe you're right in that folks who were maybe new to the ecosystem weren't sure if now they need to learn the pages router, which is going to be like changing, or it has already changed, it's still supported, but that's the new way. Do I build with the app router? Is still not stable. It's not like developed and cooked properly. So there was a time in between there where people weren't sure. Whereas now I feel like anybody starting new or building a new project, there is no doubt in my mind that you just need to jump in to the app router. Now, you mentioned three pain points. I actually wanted to ask you this from your perspective. What has been the most pain point for people? From my experience, it has been caching, because caching is a bit complex in the app router. There's different layers of caching, from the server to the client to the router cache to the global cache. Which one is which? How do you revalidate and whatnot? And this still remains the biggest confusion. And I think the dev tooling, if can be brought into this area, can really help when you can visualize, okay, this is just being served up from the cache. This is not. It would be great.
Yeah.
In, so, is there anything coming specifically as far as the dev tools for caching and solving the problem there, or bringing some shining some light into what's going on in your app?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think well, to answer your question, yes. Um, in pretty much every medium to large scale application, web application, website, there's layers of caches somewhere. Whether they're in Next.js or they're on your server or they're somewhere in between, like a backend for front end or some API layer, the caches are always there. They just weren't always as opinionated at the Next.js level about where the cache is. So one of the things that is mostly an education problem is trying to explain that Next.js has an opinion now about a way to orchestrate mutating data and fetching data across the client and the server. And if you buy into that experience, it can be pretty smooth. The part where I don't think we've done a great job is when you want to eject out of pieces of that experience. Part of this is going back to education. It's little things like folks who maybe aren't sure about server actions because they hadn't been published to the stable React channel yet. But now that that's happening, I think that will also help some folks out with that feeling, which then led them down a path of exploring route handlers, where route handlers aren't really the intended solution for this. Route handlers are kind of a escape hatch in some ways. I think that the biggest issues that I see are around knowing whether it's the right time to kind of go all in on that model for the type of application they're building, like whether they want to do kind of the full stack in Next.js. And then the second one is the differences between caching and pre-rendering. And I think the lack of dev tools certainly makes this a bit more difficult. By default, what Next.js has done for a really long time, since Next.js 9, is try to automatically statically optimize your application. If you can make part of it static, let's do it. If you have code that needs to run dynamically, that's also fine. But if we can speed things up automatically for you, let's do it. Part of the confusion comes from folks thinking I'm fetching some data in a server component and I run a build, and now I don't see that data fresh every single time. Why is that? And that's actually not a caching problem. It's a pre-rendering problem. But they are very coupled insofar as you kind of need to understand both mental models to make your way through that journey. And I think we have some, we're cooking on some ideas for how we might make that more clear in the future. The second thing here is there's kind of three general categories of data mutations today in the app router. There's mutations that I trigger myself. So I have a form, I hit submit on the form and the button. I call revalidate path or revalidate tag, and it clears all of the caches. So should be no problem with that one. The second one is I'm listening to events. So my CMS or my database publishes events, calls a webhook, and that webhook calls revalidate tag or revalidate path. Again, should be fine. The third one, and this is why I mentioned like opting out of some of the caching things had been difficult up until this last release, is I'm building a car website. I've got 2 million cars. And when I reload the page, I want to see the latest cars. Well, that's doable. But the way Next.js works by default is it tries to be smart and help transitions between pages be fast. And to do that, there's this router cache you mentioned. Well, if I'm going back and forth between pages and I just want to turn things off so that I always see the latest cars, it is objectively a worse user experience to have to wait and load the cars, but that might not be, you might be okay with that trade-off because of the data consistency. I want to see the latest data. So up until the last release with the experimental stale time feature we added, that was pretty difficult to do. And I think that that caused a lot of problems. But we really wanted to get to the root of what people were trying to do so that we could let it influence the ultimate solution that we want to do with iterating on this caching feedback. So to go all the way back to your question, we need to change some of the architecture of caching in general, but then also provide dev tools to help you reason about how your system is working. One underrated one that I think more people could use today is we have an option in the Next config called logging, and it logs out all of the calls to your fetch cache or your unstable cache function. So it's nice to have that visibility. You can see whether it's a cache hit. If I command shift R, then I can see that it was a miss and I reload. Now it's a hit again. Like little things like that can make a really big difference. So yeah.
In understanding what's going on. Now, yeah, you're right. In some of the stuff, as you mentioned, may not be specifically a caching problem, but it kind of ties, it's coupled, it's interweaved so tightly that it might look like a caching problem with the revalidations on demand or in response to a webhook. I think personally, from the feedback that I've gotten from the community, maybe the most confusion is around the router cache. Because the global cache or the HTTP cache has been there, as you mentioned, it has been in all the previous or any apps that you build. There's an HTTP cache or layer probably serving up content without having to hit your server all the time. But the router cache, which just saves the payload of not having to just fetch the server components again, may be creating some of that confusion, or folks trying to get something and then the app is not responding the way that they kind of needed to, or not knowing that by default Next.js actually tries to optimize the most. So if you have an API route which is using a get post or a get route, it's just static by default unless you opt out of it. So oftentimes
Yeah.
these kinds of maybe educational or lack of not knowing what the default is causes the problem.
Yeah, the way that's helped for me for route handlers and why I always say that they're like an injection is they're kind of the lowest level building block and primitive of pages and layouts and other abstractions on top, which means the caching semantics that apply to pages and layouts also apply to route handlers. They're static by default, but then if I read from the request or I use some function like cookies or headers, now it's dynamic. And I think that we can improve that in general across like that heuristic across Next.js in general to make it a little bit more clear. But I think one of the trickiest parts there has been not new people who are trying route handlers for the first time, but people who think, which I understand how this happens, that route handlers are a one-to-one replacement of API routes in the pages router, where that behavior was different. It was dynamic by default all the time. I also think like going back to your point around caching and pre-rendering like kind of being intrinsically linked together and how that makes this a bit more difficult to unwind too. Like this has been really the source of a lot of customer feedback and where we've been trying to iterate towards a better solution for caching. So it's still cooking right now, but I'm feeling pretty decent about that. The other bit I wanted to mention was to your point about the main feedback was around the router cache. One of the hard parts here is an education problem of two things. why does the router cache exist in general, and what other factors um, might you run into that you don't expect, and then transitions. So I'll start with the first one, which is I don't think it's obvious for a lot of folks that when you're navigating between routes, that your layouts can be cached and you don't have to refetch. And that design constraint is really powerful for a lot of types of applications. It not only does it reduce the payload of the amount of data that you're requesting on every page load, but when it's integrated into the router cache, it can also mean that you get an instant transition between your pages because it can just automatically read from the cache. So in theory, that works great. Where it gets tricky is when you're opting when you're in a situation where you're fetching dynamic data that's not cached. Because as you've probably seen this before, you click on a link, you click on a button, your application begins to transition into the next state, but you're fetching data. So it doesn't feel as instantaneous as before because React has kind of taken over the page transition life cycle. I think one of the hardest parts about the app router has been not only bringing folks along for the journey in Next.js, but helping teach about these new React features as well too. Because transitions, React transitions, are not really something that up until this React 19 release were something that you would use in user code. It was things that were primarily used by libraries and frameworks. So I would say most React developers didn't really have a great understanding of what a transition was or when it would be useful. And in the app router, all navigations are built on transitions. So, for example, there's been an open thread asking about how do I replicate this router event emitting system that the Pages router had? How do I do that in the app router? And it turns out that for a lot of the use cases that people were doing before, it's kind of just built into handling transitions. React has a hook where you can listen to the transition. Tim actually published a fun library and example showing how you could do like a global navigation, like pending bar when you're transitioning between pages that listens for the start of the transition and then when it ends, how you can like prevent navigating away from the page when you have unsaved form changes. But like the hard part to get everyone to that journey was actually for them to understand why the design constraint exists in the first place. Like, why are transitions there and why do we think that that's a good thing in general? And I think, at least for me, the eye opening part for me, transitions and this architecture that we're building on unlock this world of like doing work in the background. It's like forking your UI into different variations so that when I click on something, I can show immediate feedback. And I also don't have to block other user interactions, which is a better user experience, while I'm still in this parallel world or in this fork building my new version of the UI or transitioning to this new version of the UI. And I can cancel that, right? If I don't want to go there. But the fact that that is now like a native primitive, I think is really powerful. It just takes a little bit of time to teach why and also the practical applications of it.
Yeah, I agree that definitely has been a point of uh, a light bulb for me as well. Like the concurrent API and the primitives, and specifically these new features introduced in React 19, which was the way that this transition works behind the scene. Um, Actually, having played with this new hooks and the idea of the transition made me understand what's going on behind the scene when you are actually making this transition and how it ties back into uh, now navigation on the client side in Next.js, which is coupled with React. And I think it's good, like you mentioned earlier, that Next.js decided or bet on kind of going all in this new direction that React was going. And I think doing that allowed all of us to also learn along the way, because these new features that uh, aren't yet even released in React 19 yet. We have all played around with, we have all understood them to a level that we are now comfortable. Because
Mm-hmm.
previously React was, cooking these new features and then releasing them when they were stable and you could use them, you could learn to use them. But now we have an understanding of what's going on, this new paradigm, these new features, these new concepts, and then now they come into surface
Mm-hmm.
thanks to the next
Yeah.
Kenner channel.
And you know, I'll be honest, like this has been a tough thing for me because a lot of the exploration and the community learning along together with like us all learning all these React features together is both exciting and also can be frustrating. And a lot of that frustration, I think, has come out on Next.js. And I understand the perspective, but also I think eventually folks will start to realize kind of your perspective here, which is that this is a glimpse into the future of where we're headed. And soon a lot of the dots will connect. And I think there's an opportunity for, you know, me to help connect some of the dots better too. I think that for me personally, what really made it all click for me was the first time that I used actions, client actions, without Next.js. So I was building a React and Vite application that was using the Canary channel, which is what Next.js and frameworks are building on. And I understood hypothetically, theoretically, that actions were a thing that could be used with the same model on the client and the server. But then when I had a React app that was client only with Vite, and I wrote action and I had a client action, I didn't have to write an event handler. I was like, oh my gosh. I was able to use the form hooks that I'd been using in Next.js. It's like, wait a minute. I write the same code with the same model on the client. And then if I want to shift that to the server, it's the same programming model. I was like, oh my gosh. The theory of this was so like it made sense in theory, but actually writing the code myself was such a light bulb where it really made sense how all the pieces connected. And then even with the latest React 19 uh, beta post, where it talks about transitions and it talks about some of these new features coming out, like the used hook. It's just so exciting to see how all of that stuff is just, you know, that we've been working on for a really long time in partnership with folks on the React team, is broadly helpful for the entire ecosystem. I also saw like some of the other frameworks that have been building their own bespoke versions of a lot of these features are going to be able to upgrade to React 19 and just delete a bunch of their framework specific code, which I think is so exciting. Like resource loading, document metadata loading, a lot of these features that were kind of designed in partnership with folks on the Next.js team that were framework level features that were kind of abstracted into the library itself. Well, now if I'm building a new React framework, I don't have to solve those problems. Or if I'm evolving an old React framework, I can just update to React 19 and delete all that code, which I think is really awesome.
Absolutely. Now, this what you said gave me an idea of implementing some of these features in the context of a naked React application, maybe to make the point come across even clearer from the primitives under the hood of React and not specifically Next.js, because in the past year, it has been so interrelated that you can't really tell which one is React, which one is Next.js. As you mentioned, a lot of it is just folks thinking that this is Next.js, but some of these primitives are actually even simpler, maybe to understand when it's applied into React alone. Then you can bring the same concept into Next.js, and then only then you would feel the power of, oh, what's going on here.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's been some really good exploration in the community for people building their own toy frameworks to just try to understand how it works, or try to build like real frameworks as well too, as well as educators who have really been starting to lean into this space. I think Kent C. Dodds has been building basically like a build your own React server components framework for as part of his Epic Web series, which I think is really awesome because you go through it and you look at some of the content and you're like, wait a minute, this feels like a lot of the stuff that I've been learning in the Next.js ecosystem, and it is, and it's really exciting that that knowledge is now distributed and accessible for broadly the entire React ecosystem as well too.
Exactly. Yeah. Uh, Now, looking into future a little bit, I want to know what's coming up in Next.js specifically. I know partial pre-rendering is something that I'm really personally very uh, interested about and curious to see how that would change our applications, going from a route level static dynamic rendering to now a component level and isolating your data fetching there. And you've also had a recent tweet about edge rendering, which might kind of tie into pre-rendering and it being maybe a better kind of architecture for rendering our application using the
Mm-hmm.
Node.js runtime, server-side rendering, streaming, and then partial pre-rendering versus using the edge. So take us in that journey.
So the first one that we're working on, decoupled from those two, is bringing TurboPack to builds as well. So pretty soon we'll have a TurboPack stable release for your local dev experience. But then very quickly after that, we want to also speed up your production builds running next build as well. That one will also be happening soon. But then tying together these two threads that you mentioned, they're actually all kind of related, which is caching, partial pre-rendering, and then the actual infrastructure that helps you deploy that. So for caching, we already talked about quite a bit. It is related to partial pre-rendering though, because with partial pre-rendering, you might have noticed that Next.js tries to make as much of the page static as possible, the shell or the stencil of the page, which goes back to our roots with Next.js 9 and automatic static optimization. But then what partial pre-rendering does is it has signals, whether it's at the component level or somewhere, not signals like other framework signals, like a signal to from the user code that this component is dynamic. So whether I'm reading from the request with a cookie or a header or so on and so forth, I can tell Next.js, hey, for this part, like carve out a hole in my shell, and I want this one to run dynamically. So this idea is very much coupled with how we evolve caching. So we're kind of solving those two problems together. But I'm really excited about it because it solves, it's kind of the culmination of the better part of 6 to 8 years of research and development for how we build really fast, globally distributed websites. And it's both Next.js and Vercel. I was gonna. I looked like you might have a question, but I was
No,
gonna keep going.
no. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So going way back, Next.js started as a server rendered framework. The only thing that you could do is have a node server, and it was dynamic all the time. Then, as we got a little further along, we added static generation in 2019, I think, automatic static optimization, ISR, so on and so forth. Static is great. It can help you get a really fast initial response for your visitors. Most sites have some kind of dynamic bits on them. So there was this drop off between I like static, but then eventually I de-opt or I eject to a fully dynamic app. And now I'm faced with another challenging infrastructure or distributed systems problem, which is how do I make my application fast everywhere my customers are? Now, for some sites, that might be just in one location, one region, serving a regionalized customer base. For the internet era, right, there might be for indie hackers building products they want to sell all over the world. Ideally, they can have their product experience, their checkout flow, be fast for customers everywhere. And CDNs are not a new technology. Placing your static assets close to your visitors is not necessarily a new idea, but we want to get the benefits of that with the benefits of having dynamic content. And critically, the piece that ties it all together is streaming. So when I talked about the core architecture reason for the app router was really to unlock streaming, is because when you look at the way the largest sites on the web are built, inevitably you will reach a point where you have to stream. There's no way that you cannot stream to be able to serve the type of product experience that you want and still have a fast initial page result. I mean, that's why Google is so fast, even with the massive amounts of code that it has and the you know, millions or billions of different combinations of widgets or responses that it could render out. It can never be a static page. So how do you bring that type of experience to open source and broadly to the entire web community? Well, it's not going to be Google scale because that's way too complicated, way too complex. You know, there's millions or billions of lines of code. Um, but I think where we're headed with partial pre-rendering is hopefully close towards that direction. So the way it works is I get a fast initial response from a region, an edge region that is close to me when I'm deploying to Vercel. So I'm a customer in Europe. I get initial response from one of the European Vercel edge regions. Let's say that's 20, 30, 40 milliseconds. So really fast because the latency there is pretty close. But then rather than trying to distribute the rest of my application, the actual data and the rest of my workload to a bunch of different regions around the world, what my recent tweet was talking about is that we've actually kind of changed our opinion on the best way of doing this, primarily from customer feedback. What partial pre-rendering enables is co-locating your data with your compute, which your data is probably in US East. So I put my compute in US East. And at the same time, the edge region gives this static response back. It can also start kicking off the streaming for returning back the dynamic parts. And what ends up happening is almost a uncanny valley-like experience where it feels so fast, it feels fake because you're like, there's no way this dynamic app could be that fast. But it's kind of an illusion because it's really sending this, you know, potentially a large shell of the page very quickly in that first initial response. To round out the bit about edge rendering and why that really hasn't worked, what we heard from a lot of customers was their data workloads just weren't going to be multi-region, multi-replicated workloads. I think there's some companies that are doing a good job of doing this. Terso is a good example of a database that makes it pretty easy to do global replication. I think PlanetScale has a pretty good solution for replicating regions. I think that can work well for some people. I think we have surprised ourselves with our own dogfooding and usage of Vercel products where we have 1 to 2 regions for data, maybe 3, but it's usually just like 1 or 2. And we place our compute close to our data. And even server rendering, we've been surprised at how much faster both improvements to Node.js itself, improvements to Next.js, improvements to Vercel's infrastructure have led to a situation where I don't have to make that strange trade-off of like, I want it to be fast, but also I want to just use the libraries that I'm using, which has been it's been a tough journey over the years because the promise of this edge runtime was I'll be able to constrain my application to achieve better performance. But now it actually, what we realized in talking to and working with a lot of customers and also building things ourselves was, while that promise was true at the start, it very quickly degraded as you added more code to your constrained edge rendering situations. And the combination of that plus the replication of data that wasn't happening kind of led us back to, and I wouldn't say it's like a full pendulum swing, it's more of a switchback where the technology has evolved to make it easier to simplify your architecture. And I think we're seeing this across the industry in general. There's a push towards simplicity, even from the folks who are, you know, running their own infrastructure. They're doing their own DevOps. They're putting their own servers up in a region where their data is. And that can be surprisingly fast too, as well. I think the part that gets tricky then is when you're moving that to more globally distributed workloads and trying to find global private networks that allow you to get fast responses all over the world versus doing something that is maybe very cheap, but it comes with the cost of that traveling over the public internet tubes. Long-winded answer, but I'm happy to go into more details.
Exactly. No, I want to just circle back into things that you mentioned, which is insightful. Now, when we are talking about the edge rendering, I wanted to kind of draw the lines between different things that we might call edge, because
Yeah.
we are using edge for the CDN, for the cache, which is great. We're using edge for things like the middleware functions, routing, redirecting, and stuff. Or maybe you have config that runs on the edge. It's just we're talking about the compute that was running on the edge, runtime, which was a
Mm-hmm.
subset of the Node.js, didn't have access to all the packages and APIs, and was also kind of further away from your database unless your database was replicated all around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And with the advancement in technology now that you have the streaming, you have the partial pre-rendering, maybe soon in future, um, it's just the idea of do you really need to take the hit for that limited like APIs in the
Yep.
runtime, and then not having uh, the the database replicated around. I just wanted to try to clarify that uh, we're not talking about the edge in whole. It's just the compute
Mm-hmm.
part of it. Now, you talked about exploring some of this stuff like partial pre-rendering and streaming on Vercel products, and specifically V0. So I want
Mm-hmm.
to transition into AI and where we're going with that, generative UI and V0, specifically the Vercel AI SDK. I want to get your take on this. Is stuff it's pretty hyped up right now. I want to get your take, like firsthand from Vercel itself. So
Mm-hmm.
let's talk about V0 and where you're seeing this going. I see this new term being coined, generative UI. I saw Guillermo talk in Next Cloud conference, also talking about generative UI. So walk us through that. What is it, and how are we going to see that evolve?
Mm-hmm. Well, to continue from our last point around dog fooding V0 for some of our latest improvements on our compute products, our infrastructure products, um, this is really a big opportunity for us to put ourselves in the shoe of a customer or the shoes of a customer. And what does it look like to build a full stack end to end Vercel application using all of the latest features and products that we've launched? And it helps you revisit your priors of opinions that you made or assumptions about what's the best solution for the customer, just building on other customer feedback you've heard. And that was really what led us to this conclusion with V0 in building this brand new kind of full stack AI product on Vercel using all of our latest things. For those who haven't checked out V0 at v0.dev, you can write in text or you can upload images and generate React and Tailwind code from it to build the first version of your application. And really, a pair to that, what actually inspired building this product was more of a necessity of dog fooding our own AI SDK that we've been working on. We had started to build more and more AI tools and AI applications and introducing it into Vercel's product itself. And we noticed we were kind of building the same set of things. There was like a consistent pattern of the type of utilities that we needed for streaming, for building chatbot like experiences at the start. So we abstracted them out into this AI SDK. And it really turned into V0 as a product where we were able to kind of open source the underlying ability to not only return text-based responses from large language models, but also connect them to React components. And the really fun full circle thing about all of this is like this entire thing, this entire AI boom of generative UI, the AI SDK, all of these experiences that we've been showing lately, none of that is possible without React Server components
And
and
streaming.
streaming,
Yeah.
which is I would be lying if I said that we had this grand intuition and vision that all of the pieces were going to come together and that ChatGPT was going to get released and the world was going to, it's like, no, it kind of, we were just in the right place in the right time in the right direction. And now seeing all the pieces come together, it has me more excited than ever about the future experiences and future products that we'll build on the web. Generative UI, going back to your framing there, really just means that a lot of the product and user experiences on the web today could be entirely reimagined with these powerful AI tools that we have today that I'm sure will be look small in comparison to the AI tools of next year. And when you do that, you might be able to change the experience in a large way thanks to large language models, especially ones that can do more than just generate text only.
Absolutely. So it's interesting you mentioned how Next.js and the new development in React feels like it has been there all along with this new developments in AI. Because once I also first started using more AIs and tools and also the AI SDK from Vercel, I just realized how nicely it ties into streaming, and we now have streaming in Next.js. It just aligned so perfectly at this point in time with the advancement in technology and AI. So we talked about the AI stuff. We covered Next.js, and I think that's pretty much what I wanted to get your take on. Now, a concern that I see in the community sometimes popping up about AI is the new tools that are going to replace us as developers. I wanted to also get your take on that. Tools like Devin that just was recently announced for folks who want to enter into web development or into tech and they're new into this
Mm.
stuff, thinking, do I really want to even get into this? I'm going to be replaced by this, or soon we don't have to even code. What is your take on it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's millions of developers today, somewhere between, I don't know, 40 and 100 million developers, let's say. I don't know the exact numbers. But how many people know how to use a computer? Quite a bit more. How many people are designers today who have no development experience? A lot. I think there's a huge number of folks who will become developers, even if what a developer is today evolves a bit over time. You are someone who is using a computer to get a task done, and that computer might be a very powerful AI enhanced machine that helps you write code much faster, even if that code is maybe a level of abstraction higher. You know, we're not writing assembly code anymore. There's been layers of abstraction built on top. And maybe like English is the ultimate programming language. Maybe in the future you write markdown files and those are the instructions to tools that help you get tasks done. I think that we're in the state of AI right now where it's all very new and moving very quickly. And a lot of the projections can seem unrealistic, especially the claims around like, well, AI will replace developers. We won't need developers anymore. It's a good title. It's a good like headline. I think realistically, it just evolves the definition of what a developer is and increases the surface area of who can be invited to the party. You know, who can use these tools. There will only be more opportunities for people to do a lot of the more advanced work around AI in the future as well too. And for me personally, why I have shifted to using the term product engineer more and why I like that term is that in an AI first world, the product experience is really what matters. Front end and back end, yeah, it matters. But really, at the end of the day, we're trying to build great products. We're trying to design great product experiences.
That people
And
want.
we're just trying to be builders of tools, of products. And if I have an AI assistant that can go do a bunch of this work in the background,
Why
great. I'm gonna welcome that. I'm still gonna test it because I don't know if it's gonna get it right the first time. But I'm not opposed to the trajectory we're on.
I love your take on it, and I share the same view in that it changes the way we maybe develop. It's a tool definitely that will bring in a level of abstraction, making it easy for more people to do this, as it has been throughout the time for web development. Even right now with tools like Next.js, if you compare the way that you would have built front end 5, 6, 7 years ago
Mm-hmm.
compared to how easy it is for anyone to become a developer with these great tools that just abstract away the details that you don't need to know or worry about, and enabling you to just build a product that people or users or customers want to use. I see it in the same way that it would transform in the way that we maybe develop or write code, but ultimately won't take our job away from us. Now, I know Vercel ship is around the corner. For anyone who's interested to know about the cutting edge technologies and in the AI space specifically, you can attend live the keynote, I think, for free, and the in person conferences in New York. I don't know if there's still room for people to join, but we would include links in the description for sure. Now, it was very fun talking to you. I hope folks also had as much fun and insight as I had sharing this session with you. I want to once again acknowledge you, Lee, for the impact you had on me, specifically my journey of learning Next.js and becoming a web developer, producing content, putting myself out there and learning in public, and probably for many others. So thank you for whatever that you had done and your contribution to Next.js community. And thank you for joining me. Hopefully, we'll have you on for more sessions. Hopefully, this is the first to many more.
Yeah, I
Any
appreciate that. Thank you for having me.
awesome. Any final words?
I would say if you want to learn more about Next.js, go to nextjs.org. I'm sure most of the folks watching have already tried it out, but if you haven't, go check it out. I'd love to hear your feedback about Vercel or Next.js. And thanks for listening.
Awesome, folks. So that's a wrap for this video, folks. If you have any questions, like always, hit me up in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.